Hey folks, Michael here again with the CCERP podcast. Cypress Creek Ecological Restoration Project. E is for ecology. Ecology studies the things that make up the living things and non-living things that make up an area, how they act and interact. The birds, the insects, the trees, the plants, the animals, the water, the sun, the geography. We are a part of that. We got to apply ecology to ourselves too. And again, today we're going to be talking about that aspect of it, human ecology, how we move. As some trackers like Tom Brown III say, an animal is an instrument played by its environment. So if we stay indoors all the time, our instrument is going to be determined by that, and we're going to be an instrument that doesn't sound good and can't do very much. What we got to do is get outdoors more. If we want to study ecology and know it, it comes from getting outdoors. It's not by reading books, which is just a bunch of words. You got to get out and experience it yourself. That can be a guide, like a map, but you got to get out and take the journey on your own if you're going to actually know and understand. You know, there's got to be some first-hand knowledge to have actual real first-hand experience of actual real knowledge. And if we're going to clean up, if we're going to remove invasive species, if we're going to enjoy, if we're going to get out with family and friends, that means getting out. It means moving in nature. And then if we get out, it can help us get in better shape. Instead of having someone blast out directions sometimes, like run in place, jumping jacks, 10 push-ups, run in place, like get in bear crawl position, blah blah blah. Or when you're running along, you know, everyone runs along a football field. Down, up, run left, run right, down. You know, let nature make the call. Go out and move through the forest. You know, there's an open space and you can move faster. Then you got to slow down to duck under some shrubbery, and nature's making the call, and it's the same thing. It's like duck, step over, go around the tree, crawl, walk real slow, run, jump over this. You know, stuff like that. Don't step here, step there. It is calling all the shots in so much more of a way than any person could. Where you put your feet, what you look at, how you position your body. So if you get out and let nature play you like an instrument, you'll have, you learn much better mobility, strength, attunement to the environment, mindfulness. So get out and do it, but, we need to know good technique, not because we're dumb, but because we lost sight of that, just like I did. Without some of the training I've gotten the last few years, I wouldn't know what I do, that I know now. I used to be like pretty pathetic because I could barely walk on a manicured yard. Even that, I'd like stumble and be awkward. But because of natural movement, this MoveNat stuff, getting outside, going barefoot, I'm a lot more mobile and competent than I was before. I used to not have good balance. I was awkward, uncoordinated. It's like, I'm just shocked at the stuff I could do now. I would not have thought it possible. But, it's because of MoveNat and the logical progressions they have. As I've talked about before, it's like very scientific in the way it's put together and structured. A nice hierarchical step-by-step thing. Kind of like martial arts for movement in general. Very methodical, very well laid out, thought out method of progressing step by step. But so we got Jack Mullaly again with us from way down under. He's ahead of our times. So we're way back on Wednesday, and he's like whoosh, shot ahead on Thursday already. He's ahead of us. We're always trying to catch up.
I mean, I'd like to think so, but No, in all seriousness, thank you for having me back. I had a really good chat last time, and I imagine we're going to do the same right now.
Heck yeah. So, first of all, anything else you want to tell folks about yourself? So folks can listen to the last conversation we had with Jack. And you talked about your background. Anything else you might want to add to that you forgot?
Yeah, so I will give a tiny bit of background. The biggest thing I want to talk about right now is your intro as you were going through there. And you said various things. Like, there were literally 4 or 5 things in there where I was like, oh, I want to talk about that. Oh, I want to talk about that.
Cool.
So I'll segue back to that in a second and just hijack your agenda for the podcast. But in all seriousness, so my name's Jack Mullaly. I am a few different things. I wear a few different hats, but at the same time, they all feel pretty similar to me. So I own a gym in Brisbane, in Australia, called ID Anthro Movement.
So if you're down in Australia visiting sometime, you know where to go.
Yeah, and I'm going to do something that's really strange here for a business owner, but because I like to give a shout out to another gym as well. So I'm on the south side of Brisbane. Our gym's reasonably new, but one of the gyms that I took a lot of inspiration from when I opened this place was a place called Stage 6 Health and Fitness, who are on the north side of Brisbane. The owners there, Matt and Amelia, are awesome. Matt is actually the Australia Pacific MoveNat team instructor.
Okay.
Anyway, I just really like to also give them a shout out because I feel that we're very much on the same page and whatnot. Anyhow, so
what's the name of that gym?
Stage 6 Health and Fitness.
We'll put it in the show notes. Okay.
Yeah, wicked. Thank you. And yeah, so I own this gym, ID Anthro Movement, where I teach people to move better. We deliver health and fitness, but it's through an approach that is very much inspired by MoveNat, very much inspired by moving naturally in the way we're designed to. My background professionally is actually as an environmental engineer, which has exposed me to a bunch of ecology in the past. I'm not an ecologist, but I spent a bunch of time with ecologists and studied a bit of ecology on the side of things.
Cool.
And I see a lot of similarities, a lot of interconnections between the way ecology thinks about the natural world and the way a practice like MoveNat thinks about the human body. And I think they are both the right way to go. And I happen to have a background as a competitor in a little-known sport called bike trials, where you ride a bike over obstacles like rocks and logs and concrete pipes and stuff.
Cool, yeah.
So that's plenty of me. Where I want to segue this to briefly is, you mentioned a quote in your intro, which was along the lines of, an animal is an instrument being played by its environment. Mm-hmm. I got that close enough to write. And so that reminded me of something. On my wall, just kind of around the corner from where I'm standing at the gym right now, I have a quote, which I don't know where the quote was initially from, but I heard someone say it in a Tim Ferriss podcast. But it's, music is the space between the notes. So I'll say that again. The quote is that music is the space between the notes. And what it's getting at here is, I mean, you could think of any song that you want, and if you imagine that if you play all the notes in the correct order, but just one after another, just in like dead time, just boom, 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 there's nothing there. There's nothing to it. It's the interaction from one note to the next and how long it takes from that note into the other one, how it blends with it, how it transitions, that makes for music. And I think it's the same for real-world healthy movement. And I think this is one of the things that really sets a natural movement approach apart from the traditional gym industry, is that there's an embedded assumption in traditional health and fitness that if you work each of the components individually, that somehow they will magically come together and make a healthy body. It's like if you play each of the notes in a song absolutely perfectly with no regard for how they follow each other in time. Whereas real movement emphasizes both the fact that the whole body is moving and everything's getting worked and doing its job, but it has the relationship of, how do they actually fit together into real functional movement?
Or it'd be like, you're in marching band and, okay, we're going to work on walking separate. One day we're going to walk. One day you're just going to sit there wearing your uniform inside. Another day we're going to practice. Okay, so, or we'll do like 5 minutes of walking. Okay, now go inside and put on your uniform and sit there for 5 minutes. Okay, now play your instrument for 5 minutes. Okay, now read music for 5 minutes. Okay, now follow along the director for 5 minutes. And okay, we're good. Now we can like go to the parade and like play music in a marching band. No, it's not going to sync.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Like, that is exactly what the traditional fitness industry is. It's this like, as long as they do each of the parts in complete and utter isolation of the others, they will somehow come back together. And to some degree, like, so this marching band analogy is a good one. Compared to doing absolutely no practice as that marching band, then doing those isolated bits of practice will make that band better.
Mm-hmm.
Just not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas doing a far more integrated practice, that takes the time to bring things together. Like, yeah, you can practice things on their own at times. That's totally cool, and there's benefits to that. But then having a practice that also integrates it back together is what makes the magic work. And that's when natural movement is totally different to, like, certainly to things like bodybuilding, but even to things like CrossFit, where even though like CrossFit and things have more complex movements, like a clean and jerk or a snatch, like the Olympic weightlifting movements, are really complex.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you practice in things like CrossFit is still completely removed from their context within how you move in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's where natural movement, a well-designed natural movement practice anyway, is different because it integrates movement together as a whole.
Yeah, when you have a good CrossFit place and some coaches that know their stuff, because some are bad, they don't get good technique, they're too much go, go, go. But like one guy in town I know, owner of P3 CrossFit, I'm being stupid right now and forgetting his name. Oh yeah, John McPherson, level 4 coach, one of the only ones in the United States that are not on the actual CrossFit team. He's great. He knows his stuff. But yeah, and it's like, not knocking it. It's just a system is a system, and it has an audience and stuff, and has a purpose. And it's great for what it does, as long as you do it right. But because it's like you can have something focused on kids or focused on firefighters or focused whatever, nothing wrong with that. But you also need to get the bigger picture. And like the natural movement, like so CrossFit does what it does great. You can do that, and it's recommended. It's great, but you got to get the step back and look at the bigger picture and get this natural movement in, because it's not something that CrossFit gives you, not because it's pathetic or stupid, but just because it's not what it does.
Well, I mean, and so the thing here is, like, I get nervous as soon as I start talking about CrossFit in these conversations, because it's so easy in the discourse to bag on CrossFit. Like, you go online and you see tons of people just rubbishing CrossFit. But the reality is that CrossFit has done a huge, huge amount of good for the fitness industry. Yeah. Like, it is just the reality of it that from that point of view, CrossFit is incredible. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that it's perfect, and it doesn't mean that it's got all the way there. And so in my opinion, bodybuilding is better than doing nothing. If we're talking about health and longevity, so put these things aside as sports in their own rights. And if we're just talking about like health, longevity, getting out of pain, all that sort of stuff. And
being helpful, like being able to help someone in trouble, like in a flood or in an emergency situation or in a car wreck, all these different variable situations that just come up.
Yeah. So like, so bodybuilding is better than doing no exercise at all in these respects. CrossFit is better than bodybuilding. And I would contend that a natural movement practice is better than CrossFit. It's just an evolution, and there's a heap to be learned from the stuff that CrossFit does right, because CrossFit does a bunch of stuff right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think the natural movement takes it a logical step further in a number of ways.
And all the stuff it focuses on, like, it's from MoveNat that I learned about breathing, and then MoveNat, how to breathe right. And I've talked to numerous folks. It's rare that I ever find anybody who knows proper breathing mechanics. And I'm no PhD studying breathing alone. And there are some who just specialize in breathing and know just everything about it. But even just some important basics, a lot of people don't know. Football, soccer, running, coaches, people who teach martial arts or gymnastics that I've come across. Hey, how do you breathe? Uh, uh, huh? You know,
Sure.
I used to be that way too, but um,
Yeah, no, I know I'm not going to stand here pretending to be a breathing expert. Just,
yeah,
put my hand up right now and say
yeah.
that.
But yeah, it's like
But I take your point.
MoveNet covers that and all kinds of things that um, a lot of other systems don't. Or like I've heard that Danny Clark on the MoveNet team, he couldn't deadlift a certain amount. Maybe he couldn't do more than 350 or 400 or something. Um, but at one time, but in building his house, I think it was maybe recently, moving a bunch of rocks. He gets all these 80-pound rocks and he moves them. And I think he did 400-pound deadlift with like not too much trouble. So it was something like he did more effectively and efficiently than he'd been able to do before in a greater weight, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, well, so I don't know that particular story, but I can give a personal analogy for me that I think makes the same point there. And it's actually interesting that we're talking about this today because this literally happened to me yesterday. So I'll happily put my hand up and say that I am not the strongest guy in my upper body. From years of participating in the sport called bike trials, I am crazy lower body dominant.
Kind of similar here.
I at one point had a double body weight back squat,
Wow.
which it was pretty good. Like a double body weight deadlift's good. A double body weight back squat's a lot less common, but not so strong in my upper body. Anyway, recently I've been doing a bunch of rock climbing and tree climbing. Not particularly structured, not particularly as a sport or anything. Not particularly training for it, but going out, doing it a few times a week sort of thing. Came back into the gym yesterday, just randomly decided to try and do a muscle up, which I think movement was a power up, but tried to do a muscle up, which I've never been able to do well. I've been able to do them with a really large gymnastics kit, but it's been very much reliant on generating momentum with that kit. Yesterday, randomly decided to try and do a muscle up on the bar in at the gym here. Popped one out based with way less kit than ever before. And it goes up. But the interesting point about this, the interesting point is not, hey, Jack can suddenly do muscle ups well. That's not the point. The point here that I find interesting about this is that I did not in any way, I can't remember the last time I practiced a muscle up. I'd assume or tried a muscle up. I'd assume it was 3 or 4 months to go at least, probably a lot more than that. And so in sports training, there's a principle called the SAID principle, which stands for specific adaptations to impose demands. And it effectively means that you get better at what you do. So specific adaptations, bodily changes, and an imposed demand is what you do. And so the specific part means you get better at the things you do. So if I do lots of bicep curls, I will get better at doing bicep curls, but I'm not going to get better at bench pressing, just to use some fitness examples. And so what this typically gets interpreted at in the fitness industry is like, okay, well, if I want to be better at deadlifting or doing muscle ups, I have to do all this training that's really, really specific to doing deadlifts and muscle ups. Right? So if I want to get a better deadlift, I'm going to do a bunch of deadlift variations and I'm going to do some glute ham development exercises and some core stuff for my deadlift, like as accessory movements. But when you come to a natural movement approach, which has a huge amount of diversity in what you do, in the same way that rock climbing has a huge amount of diversity in upper body pulling strength compared to doing a bunch of pull-ups in the gym. Right, I could come into the gym and I could do 6 different variations of pull-ups and I would come nowhere near to the diversity of pulling arrangements that I get into when rock climbing.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing about a natural movement approach, for which rock climbing is a good analogy in this case, is because you do such a ridiculously broad variety of things, and because all those things are in real movements where the body is moving in unison as a whole, you get stronger in this whole package that then does actually help specific other movements, even if you haven't been training for them specifically. It kind of, through the sheer variety of what you're doing, it makes the said principle irrelevant. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the best way. If you're training to be a specialist in a particular sport, like you need to be the best muscle upper in the world. I'm not saying this is the way to be the best muscle upper in the world.
Yeah, or like an Olympic champion, Olympic gold medal champion.
Exactly. It's not going to make you the best gymnast on the rings in the world, right? But if you're talking about sustainable health and fitness and being broad, I mean, like pretty darn good at some specific stuff, but having a really broad, wide range of capabilities, then a natural movement-based approach is really, really useful for that and will make you better at a whole bunch of stuff that you're not even practicing.
Yeah, I think like add more evidence to that. I got to dig into this, but what I've heard, so again, I got to dig in to see like what the reference is, the factual nature of this.
Sure.
I've heard that American soldiers in the 1800s, whatever, maybe they could, I forget what it was, like a squat or something, lift over their head like 3/4 body weight or their body weight. But I think Native Americans could do like on average 1.5 or 2 times their body weight. It was, I forgot the exercise and what the exact numbers were because this was like 5 or 10 years ago. Probably more like 7 or 10. But I'd have to like try to dig that down to see if that's legit and what the actual numbers are. But I heard of things like that because the Native American lifestyle, having to do all these different movements just to survive, lift heavy things, carry it. Whereas the Americans back then were still doing a lot more than like people nowadays. But the lifestyles, by contrast, Native American versus European. The European had a lot more conveniences. They were labor-saving devices, but they're also, conveniences are great. Technology is great, but we got to be careful that conveniences don't kill. Wipes out your humanity and your potential.
Yeah, I don't know the truth or otherwise to that story, but it did remind me of something. So back earlier in this discussion, I mentioned this other gym in Brisbane called Stage 6 Health and Fitness, and I mentioned Matt, who's one of the owners and is the MoveNat Australia Pacific team instructor. So he does the MoveNat certs in Australia. And one of the things whenever I go over and spend time with them and train with them, so Matt's this guy that hopefully I don't get anything wrong, Matt, but to the best of my knowledge, grew up on a farm, farm boy, owns a natural movement gym. But to look at him, like, he's a little taller than me, so he must be pushing towards 6 foot. But he's really quite lean. Like, he's not a bulky guy. And so to look at him, like, if you just looked at him on the street, you'd be like, oh yeah, he's athletic, but he's not some power lifter. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And yet, if you get in with him and do anything like one-on-one gameplay, like anything that resembles wrestling, and he does have a martial arts background, but if you get in and wrestle with him, he's got a game that we sometimes play where you get a gymnastics ring. You each hold onto the same gymnastics ring, and you try and wrestle it out of the other person's grip. You do that with Matt, and it's just like there are depths of strengths within this guy that I just do not understand. It's like being hit by a wizard. You're just like, I do not understand. I don't understand how strong you are because you're so much stronger than me that I don't get it. I can't see it. And I don't understand how you're that strong because you're relatively lean and wiry. And yet, but I believe in, and I don't think that's genetics. I think that comes from his background and then the fact that, his background on a farm, growing up in a rural life, and then now owning a MoveNat gym. So what he does all day is he moves naturally while teaching people to move. Random story. Don't know where I was going with that, but hi Matt.
Yeah, but it makes sense. Like I've heard someone talk about someone she knew, and some friends, and sometimes some people they work out and their arms get bigger, but I think there's some people, you press into their arm, and part of their strength lies in their muscle density. It gets so dense that they're just rock solid. The muscle developed not so much by increasing in like bulk, radius away from the arm, but just sheer density,
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
something like that.
There's probably discussions to be had here about like hypertrophy and growth of individual muscle fibers versus increasing density of muscle fibers, or
all kinds of stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. That would so substantially get out of my depth to start talking there. And I think I also think don't get me wrong. If you're a bodybuilder and like your sport is to be a bodybuilder, then that is clearly absolutely important for you to know it. But if you are interested in health and fitness and functionality, it's an utter irrelevance, because the best way to get there is to move naturally and move lots and move in great variety. And it will make you strong however your body is meant to be, like however your body is genetically programmed. Mm-hmm. And for some people, that means that you will put on more bulk. And for some people, you're not going to, because you happen to be someone who just genetically doesn't put on a lot of bulk. But it will make you stronger, and it will make you fitter, and it will make you more functional.
Yeah.
So I tend to think discussions about hypertrophy from a health point of view are pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah. And in terms of the SAID principle, SAID, with some stuff, you could also look at it as not so much not being relevant, but doing a bunch of different things at one time, kind of like multitasking the SAID, like climbing a tree, because climbing a tree, you're working on like its whole body stuff. You're using your legs to push. You're using your arms to pull. Using your hands to grip. It takes a lot of. It's working on hip mobility at the same time. I'm climbing a tree, and it's not just like walking upstairs, but I've got to lift. I'm balancing on my left foot, and I got to lift my right foot up to all kinds of different heights and at different angles to put it on a branch to be able to step up from there while I'm holding on with my other hands, and then I pull. There's just, so much range of motion and so much variation in movement in that one thing right there.
Yeah. Well, So a few minutes ago, I think that I kind of suggested that, my rock climbing experience and its ability to develop my muscle up without me trying a muscle up made an argument against the SAID principle.
I'm just saying it's like...
but no. But
multitasking SAID, Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is the point. The other interpretation, which I think is what you're saying, is that no, it's just that in a natural movement practice, you are practicing 100 different things at once. So the SAID principle still applies, but you're getting SAID for 100 things simultaneously. Yeah,
but I wouldn't say no. It's wrong. I say you can have this perspective or this perspective.
Yeah, sure.
Don't isolate. Isolations are, unless it's for like bodybuilding or some things we talked about. In general, do not isolate. No, but you can have these different perspectives on it. Like you don't even need the SAID principle, just do general stuff. Or in this general stuff, you're multitasking the SAID. I think different ways to look at it.
Yeah.
But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I reckon I did pretty well there, railroading us down a path that wasn't on the plan for this discussion. So why don't I let you actually run your own podcast here?
That's all right. But did you want to say anything about the music thing? You brought up that metaphor. Did you finish developing your thought there?
I was cool. I was cool with the metaphor there. That was good.
And I don't know if it's like a Yo-Yo Ma quote you're thinking of, the cellist, I think he was. is or was, but he had something like that. But Yo-Yo Ma said, again, it's been like a decade or more since I heard this, so I'm just paraphrasing, not getting it exactly right probably, but he said that a great musician doesn't pay attention only to the notes, but what you do between notes. That's what makes the difference between a great musician and not great. When you're beginning, you pay attention to the notes. Then you get to a level where you can also pay attention to what you do between the notes.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. So I decided to, put my faith in Google while you were talking. So apparently the quote, which is music is the space between the notes, comes from a French composer called Claude Debussy. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, Debussy.
Who lived from 1862 to 1918.
Yeah, I'm sure it's been known for long before that. I was going to say Yo-Yo Ma probably learned it from someone. They heard it from other people. Because people are smart, and you don't have to know quantum mechanics to know something like that about music. You just got to pay attention, be curious.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so that Yo-Yo Ma quote or story that you just described, in that he's saying that a great musician pays attention to the space between the notes, because that reminds me, this is the story of my life. You say something, and it reminds me of something completely different. It reminds me of what people say about Marcelo Garcia, who was a multiple-time jiu-jitsu world champion, considered for a long time the best jiu-jitsu player in the world. But apparently, and I have no experience in jiu-jitsu, I'm just relaying something that I've heard here, but apparently his strength was that he was better at transitioning between positions than everyone else. So he'd be in a match with someone, and that other person would be trying to get into a better position than him, and he was just better at moving from one position to the next, to the next, to the next, and he'd just flow, essentially run circles around people, and then eventually there'd be an opening and he'd get in and lock them up and choke them out, or whatever. But he was better at transitioning from one position to another.
Yeah, that's the... we can also come to that from the perspective of analyzing situations in consciousness and the OODA loop. The OODA loop developed by John Boyd.
No.
What is it? Observe, orient, decide, act, and repeat. So I'm going to draw it for you. Folks won't be able to see it. But first, you observe a situation, orient, get the context, grasp what's going on. You observe the details, put it in context, then decide what to do, and then act on it, and then observe the effect, and then orient again, make another decision, act. And he did that looking at fighter pilots and his own flying, and then applied this to warfare in general.
Okay.
So he found that people who could go through the loop faster were the ones that would win in fights.
So that does sound, so in that framework, it does sound like Marcelo Garcia was quicker at going through the loop, potentially mentally, but also in its physical manifestation.
Well, yeah, you got to be able to act. That's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Intriguing.
Yeah. But so cool. And then to remind folks, some of this stuff is important in being able to do stuff outdoors. So, you can do a deadlift or a squat or something with an even symmetric bar on a perfectly flat floor with nothing around and no obstructions. But what about if you're out bicycling on a mountain bike trail, someone falls, and you need to pick them up to carry them to bring them to a hospital or where an ambulance can get them? What about if someone is on their bicycle and falls and slips down a slope? Or even today, I saw some guy that might have needed help some people were out who were gonna do like construction project, and one guy had an instrument, and because he's not used to being outdoors, he did not properly assess the friction on a slope and the steepness of it. So in trying to walk down it, I didn't see what happened at first, but all I heard was the slipping noise and someone yell something. And then I turned and saw this guy, I think he was face down, slipping down this like big piece of concrete. And then someone came down and helped him get up, and I guess he was okay and he could walk off on his own. But what if something happened and he needed help, broke a leg, hit his head, became unconscious? You're on the side of a concrete slope with someone just slipped down, and then you're on this, like, it goes to this grassy bank, then you got this ditch right there. What are you going to do? Or, like I saw some people on an ambulance recently too, 3 of them, and pretty much all of them were overweight and had very limited mobility. No way would they have been able to efficiently go down and get this guy if they were the ones that came. Overweight, not good joint mobility. You could tell that they had poor movement efficiency, were unaware of how to move well, would not have been able to effectively and efficiently and quickly and smartly navigate the terrain, go to the person, and like move them back up the slope right away. We got to be ready for things like that, because you can't say, well, emergency medical will take care of it, because that's probably like a average slice right there of emergency medical. You got some folks that are in more shape, but these 3 I saw get off this one ambulance, overweight, not good movers.
I was going to say, you're talking about I think it's a MoveNat principle, but be fit to be helpful, or be fit to be useful. Yeah. Exactly. So,
there's like situations like that, or what if you're out running somewhere alone? Like, how are you going to get back? If you break your leg and no one's out there, can you drag yourself to safety? Or like not so much to safety, because it's like not really dangerous, but drag yourself to where someone can find you? Can you crawl? Yeah. Can you move? Like, can you hop on one leg for a while? It's something we need to consider. Or as I say, if we want to go out, as I said at the beginning, if we want to go out and clean up an area really well, take care of animals, plants, remove invasive species, study the ecology, we got to be able to engage in a broad range of movements. It's a, essential skill, critical, not optional.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just a reminder there, and kind of concretize things a little bit in context of what's going on in the outdoors and around here.
The outdoors is... So we as a species, obviously we evolved to live in an outdoor natural environment. Something that I think about as a gym owner all the time is, how do I give people the variety and the context, like as close to what the outdoors would give as I can, but I'm indoors? Because there is something like, while it's great to be outdoors and moving through the outdoors, the reality is that, at least initially, for most people who want to get fit and are looking for the best way to get fit, saying, you should find a way to go out to a forest and move through the forest, sort of thing, it's a pretty big conceptual leap.
And physical too. And
gyms are really convenient. If I live in suburbia like I do, it's a lot easier after work, when I have a limited amount of time, to get into a gym than it is to go out into the bush. But then it becomes imperative that I, as a gym owner, try and give people the experience in the gym that most closely resembles what they would have experienced in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, if I break that down to its principles, and I think about, this is how I tend to think about this, so I'll be interested to see what you say. When I think about how we as a species would have naturally moved in the past, I think that from a movement point of view, our bodies tend to want three things. They want us to move a fair bit, certainly a lot more than most of us currently do in the modern world. They want us to move well, so whatever movement we're doing to be quality movement. And I think that our bodies want a lot of variety of movement, and subtle variety. Variety of the type where, you're walking, if you compare walking down a footpath to walking in the bush, the footpath, every step is the same, but in the bush, you have to step over a log, around the tree, you step on a rock, and rolls your ankle over just a little bit, but not too much, like that level of variety. And I think that's the one that is most challenging for the gym industry to deliver.
Yeah.
So I mean, even if you look at something like CrossFit, to use it as an analogy again, CrossFit will help people get more movement into their lives. It'll improve the quantity of movement they're doing. A well-coached CrossFit gym, which many are, will improve the quality of people's movement within those movements that they're teaching. But compared to moving in the natural environment, moving in a CrossFit gym, there's very little variety. So I think the biggest challenge for people wanting to step from a paradigm that they might be more familiar with, so like interval style training, circuit training, functional fitness like CrossFit, I think the biggest difference and the biggest challenge to step from that into a more natural movement-based situation is, how do you add variety into people's movement practice?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I do that. I think that can be done in one of three ways, and I'm currently blanking on one of them. What is it? Okay, let's start talking, and I'll come back to it.
Just think.
I got it. So one of them is with environments. So that one's the hardest one in the gym, because you have what you have in the gym. So you can bring in different equipment, you can bring in different boxes and stuff and create the environment in the gym, but it's never going to be as diverse as the natural environment. But we can build more variety in with these other two things. One of them is tools that add randomization to it. So I, for example, sometimes if I'm practicing balance, I have a bunch of balance beams in the gym, but by the time I've walked on them each a few times, like, I'm pretty familiar with them, and I'm not getting a lot of variety from my 6 different balance beams or whatever. But so what I do is I have some reaction balls, so funny shaped bouncy balls that bounce in odd directions. And so I'll stand on the balance beam and I'll bounce it off the floor. And because it's going to bounce in a funny direction, I suddenly have to reach for it to grab it. Mm-hmm. That throws me off balance. I have to bring my balance back in. Mm-hmm. So as a gym owner, we can use tools to add variety into things we would otherwise have been doing. Mm-hmm. There's a whole bunch of other ways you can do that, but that's the principle there. And the third way then is to use other people. So one of the things that we do a lot in the gym is that we play games, because when you and I are playing a game, what you do influences what I do next. So if you consider the difference between if I had a tennis ball and I'm bouncing it against a wall, then there's not a lot of variety in how that ball's bouncing back to me. Because I have control of it, I'm going to throw it pretty consistently every time. But if you and I go and play a game of handball and you're trying to beat me at that handball, then the ball's going all over the shop. I have to lunge in different ways, I have to move in different ways, and that it starts to add more variety back in. So by all means, getting out in nature is ideal, and it's what we're evolved to do. But if someone's trying to get fit and moving in a real world environment, in an indoor environment, then I think the biggest difference and the biggest challenge is how to add the variety back in. And I would suggest that people get some tools that add randomization to their movement, like balls that bounce funny, but there's a heap of different things you could get. Mm-hmm. Or find other people to train with and then play games. because that will add variety to your movement. But importantly, play lots of different games. Because if you and I just played handball all the time, then there's only so many different movements in a game of handball.
Mm-hmm.
But if we play handball today and table tennis tomorrow and the ring wrestling game that I mentioned that Matt likes to play the day after that, and then different every day, then we get heaps of variety over time as well.
Like tag, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like play tag, play the floor is lava.
Yeah.
All sorts of different things. It adds awesome variety.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's all some people can do in the context they're in, where they live, with their lifestyle. They don't have access to nature. Unfortunately, we're kind of primitive in that respect. Maybe when things are more advanced, we'll have little areas that are like 20 yards by 60 yards or something, where there's a bunch of trees and stuff, and it's called a gym,
Well, so
inside cities, but
so here's an interesting point. I've toyed with the idea that this is something I might like to do in the future. So currently my gym is in a shop front space, effectively, in a commercial area. So I'm in with all the other shops around here. But once you leave this commercial area, this little shopping precinct, effectively, you've got houses all around it. And the area that I live in, because it's an older suburban area, has quite big blocks, often 800 square metre blocks. I don't know what that is in square feet or anything for our American viewers, but it's pretty large. It's a decent sized block for inside a city. You going to do the conversion for me?
Yeah, 800. Go ahead.
But anyway, the point is, I can see a future where it would be good to have a gym that's actually on what's currently a house block, and to convert the house into an indoor area for a gym, because there are benefits to having indoor areas for gyms, but then to have all the open backyard space somewhat planted out, somewhat designed with like pseudo-natural movement obstacles and the like, to bring, kind of as you're saying, a bit of nature back into the suburban context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 800 square meters is about 950, 1,000 square yards.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. Yep.
So, that'd be what, like, if a football field is 100 yards by 50 yards, is it? I don't know. Not 100 by 100, 100 by 50 maybe. Then that'd be what, like 5,000 yards, so like a fifth of a football field maybe.
Yeah, fifth or sixth of a footy field. Yep, makes sense.
But, so yeah, absent that, and because some people can't get out in nature, unfortunately, because of parks and stuff, and the way culture has developed through the centuries, sometimes you have to go to a gym. And then just as going barefoot, transitioning from shoes to barefoot, I think it's important for some folks, most folks, to go to it via a gym, learn the movements in a safer environment. Your skin and nervous system have to get used to these things, like going barefoot in more of a controlled place first before you get outside. Let your skin have time to develop. Be better using some metal bars or wood bars to do some hanging and pull-up stuff before you get something rougher, like some tree surfaces, like some oak.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like the idealist in me would love if it was possible that we could just say to people, go out and move more in nature, and everyone could do it. But the gym owner in me certainly knows that many people who come and see me are going to be far more comfortable, at least starting their journey in this space in a gym or in a controlled environment, or dabbling with it themselves at home rather than out in the forest. And that's, I totally get that. It's cool. Clearly, I get it. I own a gym.
Yeah, and it makes it easier to go from what you know to what you don't. The outdoors is, to a lot of people nowadays, unknown, strange, scary. So they can start making the transition through the gym, just like the thing, like I think we talked about, like unconscious incompetence.
Yes.
Conscious incompetence, conscious competence, unconscious competence. The gym
Yep.
helps you make that transition. So
Yeah, from conscious and to conscious. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I see
the way I like to put it is, first we're stupid and we don't know it. Then we're like, oh snap, God, I'm so stupid. Then it's like, okay, I can do it. And then it's just second nature and it's habit.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I was reflecting on last time we spoke and like trying to give advice for people wanting to start going barefoot outdoors. And one of the challenges with that for me is that because I do it a lot now and have been doing it for quite some time, was I would suggest that I'm at the unconscious competence phase for that particular thing. So then trying to re-engineer, well, hang on, what are the things that I'm actually that I was once conscious of? Was an interesting experience trying to re-engineer that.
Yeah. That's the important part for teaching, knowing how you develop. It's one thing that makes some people not be able to teach well. They get to unconscious competence, forget where everything came from, and then they're like, how do you not know this?
Yep.
If you don't know, I can't teach you.
And I stumble across things like that sometimes when I'm teaching people, even still, where someone comes in and just for whatever reason, that particular thing challenges them in a way that I didn't expect or I haven't seen before, I haven't seen recently. And there's that moment where you're like, oh, hang on, right, okay. Well, we're going to have to adjust it in this particular way. But that's what a good coach should be able to do, is to adjust on the fly, even when they're caught off guard.
And that's the danger of specializing. People get into the unconscious competence because they just have one career and don't do anything else, and they forget what learning's like in general. So it's good to take up new things to make sure you're back in that like I'm stupid and I don't know it phase, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm embarrassed, I'm so stupid. It's like, God, I'm embarrassed looking at myself in the mirror, I'm embarrassed around other people, how pathetic I am at doing this, or thinking through this process, learning this field. I'm so stupid. Of course, I'm just exaggerating. We shouldn't actually say that to ourselves like that. We should be a lot nicer and more sensible and reasonable. But it's fun to put it that way. But
yeah, no, I know where you're coming from. So it reminds me of how, like, I think that learning is a skill in its own right. Mm-hmm. So you can, we could pick half a dozen different things that I might want to learn to do. And initially, when you start learning them, every time that you go and learn something new, it's like learning for the first time. It's like, oh, okay, I just learned to throw a ball. I just learned to play the banjo. I just learned to whatever. But after a number of times, it turns out that there are similarities in all learning experiences. There's similarities in what practice should look like. There's similarities in how much you should challenge yourself. There's similarities in what your thought process is going to be like when things get tough. And so on and so forth. So it's certainly the case that, the more different things that we try and learn, the more comfortable in general we become with the concept of learning.
Mm-hmm. And that's important to being a human being. Just hadn't thought of it like that before, but we're, thinkers, as Aristotle said, something like, if, it's thought that people should be able to defend themselves physically, but even more so, we should be able to defend ourselves mentally or intellectually, because reasoning is the distinctive feature of being human. He said it more eloquently. I don't remember the exact thing, but that's kind of the idea. Yeah. It's like reasoning and thinking is very important to what we do. So to really fully survive and thrive and bring out our human potential and make the most of our lives, we should be engaged in learning.
mean, it makes sense to me. I hadn't heard the quote before, but I see where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that was one thing he had in his book on rhetoric, or else I think it's thought that a lot of the things that we have from Aristotle today are notes that his students took in class.
Yeah. Well, and I always get nervous when, trying to quote anything, because there's also so many, not that I'm saying this is the case here, but there's so many just falsely attributed quotes.
Yeah, I always look it up. Like, some people say it's a quote from Abraham Lincoln, and you look it up. No.
Yeah. I was just trying to think of Lincoln's name, because not being American, I'm joking here, but for your American viewers, I know that Abraham Lincoln is obviously an incredible figure in American history. For the rest of the world, his name doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just teasing. But in all seriousness, I was just trying to think of his name then to make exactly the same point. It seems like Abraham Lincoln said everything that was ever said.
Or Gandhi.
Or Einstein.
Yeah.
There's a quote. There's actually a quote that I've seen recently floating around the movement world, like the natural movement world, which is that the highest form of research is play, and it gets attributed to Einstein.
Yeah.
He never said it.
Yeah.
He did say some things that effectively stressed the importance of play, and then those were re-quoted by other people, and those people said that the highest form of research was play. Yeah. But then it's attributed to Einstein, but he never said it.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. But the quote about Aristotle is correct. I know. I have a degree in philosophy. Yeah. Besides, I'm listening to the rhetoric, and I just read it the other day. And I'll quote it for folks so they can see it for themselves. But, yeah.
I certainly didn't mean to imply that that one was true. But
yeah, I just want to clarify for folks. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a good point you make. That's one thing I always keep in mind whenever I read quotes on Facebook or the internet. It's like, I'll believe it because a lot of times it's just, quote, Abraham Lincoln or whatever. So when I do a quote now, pretty much, sometimes I might be busy or slip, but whenever I do a quote, I always give a reference.
Yeah, like, Abraham Lincoln as read in such and such. Or,
yeah, right. Or a quote from this book on this page,
Yep. Yeah, I'm with you. I like it.
Yeah. But so we've gone over a bit about the importance of natural movement, kind of what it is. Have you made some mistakes in moving outdoors? Because one thing I think you were going to say, I was talking about back in the day before I got into MoveNet, even walking on grass, I'd be awkward and unbalanced. Was that something you were going to say some stuff about or were interested in? Or was that not one of the things? Huh?
It's an interesting thing you asking me to try and think of times that I made mistakes in the natural environment. Because I can list a bunch, but I'm trying to figure out how I make that a useful anecdotal story for people. I think the reason I'm struggling with this a little is because when we move in the natural environment, when we move outdoors, there are so many different possibilities of what may confront us, as we're moving, that I can give you a list of here was the time that I tripped over a log. Here was the time that I whatever. But they're just random anecdotes out of 1,000. Mm-hmm. And so it's more like there's a meta skill here that develops over time, which is your pattern recognition starts to pick up unconsciously a whole bunch of different things that are going on. So I was struggling with what's the
I think some things for me anyway. This will give you some time to think. Maybe you can segue off this, but
okay.
Some things, as I say, that helped for me were learning some technique for something and having that logically and naturally develop from an earlier movement, easier to something later, like going from white belt to black belt. So having technique for something, having it in a whole progression of movement advancement from easier to harder, and being mindful. Some of those things have been very helpful, and I couldn't do what I do without those. Just like the walking thing on grass, getting the idea that, because if you're like that, naturally what people are going to do is, I don't feel comfortable, I'm going to walk on flat ground. And a lot of people walk on flat ground all the time, so they're forcing themselves into that situation. But then I'm reading this and that, and people point out how walking on uneven terrain helps your nervous system and your brain. And so, okay, yeah, I get that. And so I'll do that because it's makes me a better person, better human, better rational animal overall. You can see how that makes sense. And so I do it. And then, then learn ways to do it smart. Don't just get out on, some people might think, oh, well, if the grass like that is good, then if I make it even more uneven and rough, then it must be even better. And let me go fast. Well, no, we got to logically progress into this. So how do I start going barefoot? How do I go from walking on flat surfaces to walking on rough? We got to have logical progressions for each of those. And then you got to think that you can't take things in isolation, just like the muscles, skills. You got to look at, okay, well, part of the issue is not just walking on flat ground out of nowhere, but, balance and core strength, use of the arms. So those are some of the things that I've gotten out of MoveNat that have helped me develop from the pathetic, worthless wannabe mover that I was before to where I am now.
Sure. So I like that, and you've given me 3 things that I want to try and talk to here. But based on how our conversations go, we're going to get really in depth in the first one and probably forget about the others.
Cool.
But let's first one. So I agree entirely with you that having logical and sensible progressions, particularly when we're reteaching things to adults, is super useful. And so I hear you and agree entirely, and I can see the benefit that you got from having the progressions embedded in MoveNat to help you learn these skills. I do find it interesting, though, that if you look at how kids learn this stuff, and I've got a 17-month-old daughter, so I spend a bunch of time with her, watching her learn how she moves, is that while there is definitely an order within which stuff develops, it's not necessarily naturally taught to us.
Mm-hmm.
So my daughter, so there's a move in MoveNat called a tripod vault, which is effectively, if you think about how you'd probably climb over a fence if you had to do it, that's a tripod vault, most likely. There are other options, but pretty good chance, 5 out of 10 of you are now thinking of a tripod vault. My 17-month-old daughter has all of the patterning for a tripod vault. She doesn't use it to go over things, but she uses it to climb onto things, like the couch and the chairs and the kitchen table. But I didn't teach her that.
Yeah.
I do not teach her that. She learned that intuitively. She probably saw me do stuff and worked it out, but that pattern came, in inverted commas, naturally to her. Mm-hmm. Similar thing is, I was saying before, I've been doing a bunch of rock climbing recently, and I take my daughter along and she watches. She runs around madly, but she spends time in a climbing gym and watches people. And I recently took her to the park the other day, and for the first time she climbed up the little rope ladder thing up onto the playground. And what I found fascinating about that was that when she got partway up and was just getting her hand over the top of it, she had to reach around to try and find a handhold. And as it turns out, there's little holes in the top where she can get a handhold on it, but she couldn't see over as she was doing it. and she tapped her hand around exactly the same way that an experienced rock climber who's blind over the top of a climb will tap their hand around trying to find a hold. And I was like, I did not teach her how to do that, but she's either done it naturally or she's seen people in the climbing gym do it and picked it up. And so I find it, so on the one hand, I think it's like, I totally see the value that you've got from progressions. But on the other hand, I also find it funny that we need to teach progressions when so much of this stuff is learnt or can be learnt through observation. So I have a question for you, which is, before you found MoveNat, when you were like trying to move on your own, or when you were trying to move more, but you hadn't quite found MoveNat, because I gathered there was kind of a before stage and an after stage. Mm-hmm. Were you trying to learn this stuff literally by yourself, or were you moving with like another group of people, or what was your experience?
No, I just was going based on some videos I'd seen and just going outdoors, so, and it's based on the context of being a broken mover in the first place. And, seeing people have bad technique, having bad movement role models, like you see people doing the hand-foot crawl, and of course, the arms and legs are going all over the place and the back's bent and stuff like that. And it's like, squatting is squatting, and like, who cares? And deadlift is deadlift, and, being unable to have the mind to, or not having the mind to distinguish good technique from bad and good form from bad, and knowing why it's important, because of the lack of movement role models, the culture, things like that. And that's something, I think, people can to some extent develop natural movement, but it's not entirely natural, because if it was, a lot of Americans and people with the Western influence culture wouldn't be in the situation they are. They'd all be great movers.
Except if you take the quote that we opened up with along the lines of, an animal is an instrument played by its environment.
But we have free will, and that's the thing that affects us and like makes us, since we're social animals, then we get into some social conformity stuff. And that's something I was going to bring up too. I think that's one reason why your daughter does some stuff, is because it's that one thing. She's kind of being trained by nature, so it's kind of like Montessori stuff. It's like in Montessori, you got these designed learning environments, and it's probably a similar thing. You got this designed learning environment, and your daughter's growing up in that, and like nature kind of directs you to do like things correctly.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I wonder about this. So my daughter
it's complex,
like she walked at 9.5 months, which is pretty early. Like it's not the earliest the child's ever walked, right? But it's pretty early. And I've wondered for a time, like, was that just dumb luck? Like, was that genetics? Was that the fact that because I move so much more than anyone, like than a typical adult in modern society does, did she just see a lot more movement from me as a role model and therefore picked it up? I spent a lot more time, like I used to when she was even a baby, I'd put her on her back on the floor and then I'd do various crawls and stuff literally over the top of her. Like I'd do like lateral chimp and all sorts of different stuff right over her. And, I'm not saying people should do that, but I have the control to do that safely. But so I do wonder, like, how much of her developing a little bit earlier physically than most kids do was luck, or was her observing me in her environment. I don't know. I have no idea.
Genetics, the field of epigenetics, just like, as someone said on this one podcast, and I can put the quote in there so folks know I'm not making it up.
This is the story of this discussion we're having. As someone said...
As Abraham Lincoln said.
Yeah, exactly.
And Gandhi, too. But I forgot the biologist's name, but on this podcast called The Big Biology Podcast, there's even the title of their episode. As this guy said, to stress a point, he said, genes don't do crap. They do nothing without the epigenetics that control them.
Yeah, sure.
So genes are like a piece of music, and epigenetics is like how they're played. So maybe someone can choose not to play a note or to play it, or you can get one piece and play it as jazz, or play it as classical music, or play it as the blues, or play it as like rockabilly, or 70s rock and roll, or rap, or some piece of like just cacophonous mess. It's the same piece of music though.
Yeah, I mean, and so maybe that's the case here with my daughter like this. Maybe it's the case that she and every other baby has this in her DNA, and I just, by complete accident, played her DNA the right way that she walked a little early.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
But coming back to movement progressions and like learning through viewing others, something that I try and do in the gym in my teaching style is, even though there absolutely are progressions. So for something like a tripod vault, there are a number of steps I can take an absolute beginner through to build up into a tripod vault. But something that I do, rather than just spoon feeding it necessarily and being like, okay, you're going to learn this one, then you're going to learn this and learn this, I will often demonstrate things to people and then ask questions. So I'll be like, okay, I'm going to show you this particular move. And then I pose a question about, like, what's the pattern? What might be the challenging part of this? How could you make that easier? And I try and get people to think about how they would work it out for themselves.
Yeah.
So a favorite of mine is when I teach people to throw for the first time, because I have a bunch of people who, haven't, a bunch of members who, didn't learn to throw well when they were younger. I teach them to throw. And the way that I almost always start up teaching throwing is I'm like, okay, I'm going to throw a ball, and I want you to tell me where the power comes from in the throw. And I show them, and that always opens up a discussion. Sometimes they get it. Sometimes they see that the movement starts at the hip, or down in the, lower down in the body. Sometimes they don't, but it always then opens up a discussion where they get more out of it than if I just said, okay, the first thing you got to do is move your hip.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's really something in that.
Yeah, gets them engaged.
Yeah,
that's one thing that people can do a little bit on their own. Like, how do I do this, and what's going on in this movement, and how do I make it happen?
Yeah, well, it empowers the thought process, exactly the thought process that you just described, because if you get used to that process of looking at someone else do it and then thinking about it and having it go yourself, then suddenly you're not as reliant on me as the coach. So you can, say if you wanted to be better at vaulting, you could go out with a group of parkour kids, let's say, or parkour athletes, and suddenly you're in a better position to learn what they're doing because you're more used to this quite natural process of observing, thinking, and then trying to replicate.
Yeah, and thinking what movements you need to know, what fundamentals you need before you do that particular movement. So, okay, let's break it down. Like, if we're going to vault over something that's 4 feet tall, well, then naturally 3 feet tall first, and 2 feet tall.
Well, and it's also then a much better. It's a good way then to segue into moving in the natural environment, because that thought, if we take 3 steps here, which is, say, me spoon feeding you all the progressions to a movement, versus me having you in the gym but asking you questions so you kind of figure some of it out yourself, and then compared to going out and just hanging out with the parkour crew and watching them, as you progress through those 3 options, you're becoming more and more self-reliant and doing more and more of the assessment of the situation yourself.
Yeah.
And so then it's a much smaller step if you do want to go out and move in the natural environment where you're assessing it all yourself. It's a much smaller step. Whereas if we just try and go straight from I spoon fed you all the movements to there you go out and vault a tree in the bush, that's a pretty big jump still.
Yeah, and then part of training someone to be a good natural mover should be training them in the mindfulness, training them to be aware, to break things down, to have that logic of the situation.
Yeah, for sure.